There are two things for which I'm famous on this channel. World famous. Firstly, I look at people's arguments and I apply logic to them. And secondly, I do so without any regard for political correctness or manufactured consent. And of course, doing this has been very much helped by those who support me on Patreon. You're all very appreciated. And with this said, I feel like I'm in a good position to decide whether or not racism is right or wrong. Are the racists actually correct and it's just the lame stream cucked media that's refusing to acknowledge it because they're too scared? Well, I've been thinking about it really hard and I've come to the conclusion that racism is actually really stupid. I've been thinking about this a lot with the recent riots going on in the UK, so I thought it would be productive to explain why I feel this way. Oh, and by the way, I'm not really going to get into what exactly it means to be a racist in terms of a perfect definition. I kind of view racism to be one of those words like woke or indeed critical race theory, where mostly what matters is that we know what people mean by the term, and getting into, well, what exactly do you mean by that, and just nitpicking, well, this isn't really woke, this isn't really critical race theory, this isn't really racism, I just think is an unproductive waste of time. So I'm not necessarily saying that every single position I attack here fits under some perfect definition of racism, it just fits under a broad vibe of what people tend to understand the word racism to mean. So I don't want to see any comments below from people nitpicking the fact that I'm calling some of these positions racist, because that's really not important. Racists like to say that in just a few decades, this country will be completely taken over by non-white people, and they like to do this by walking around major cities and filming people and showing that a lot of them aren't white. Now, apart from anything else, in major cities, it's quite likely that a lot of the people there would be tourists. For example, when I walk around London, I see a huge number of East Asians, but most of those people are tourists, they're not actually staying here, and indeed, the proportion of East Asians living in the UK is relatively low. Now, sure, there are some places where you will see a very high number of African, West Asian, South Asian people who actually are in those cities because they live in those cities, and those places are disproportionately non-white. But considering that the UK is still 80% white, the fact that there are places that are disproportionately non-white means there have to be other places which are much more overwhelmingly white to balance things out. So if you do find the idea of living in a majority non-white area utterly intolerable, my advice would be just don't live in any of those very specific areas. But there are some who say the great replacement is well underway, and it won't be long until there are no places in the UK that are majority white, or at least very few places, and they'll claim this isn't fear-mongering, but rather something they are forced to acknowledge because the statistics just lay this so bare, and these statistics even come from the government saying that by 2050 or some other date, because it seems to change quite often, the majority of the UK will no longer be white British. Now, despite the fact these concerned people will tell you that they're just saying what the cold hard data forces them to acknowledge, they're actually being incredibly dishonest in their interpretation of this data and relying a lot on equivocation. Equivocation is quite simply when there are two things that are different, but what's true of one thing, you want to be true of the other thing. So you talk about the two things in a very vague way that blurs the distinction between the two things so that you can give the impression that what is true of this one thing is in fact true of this other thing. So by way of example, let's say the thing you wanted to communicate is that the UK is becoming noticeably non-white. So this is what you get the impression of from these videos of people walking around cities where they're filming all sorts of people, and there are so many non-white people that a white British person would almost seem out of place and like a foreigner in their own land. So the truth that these videos are communicating is that in some places, the UK is noticeably changing in terms of demographics. Now, the next thing would be the predictions that the UK is going to become majority non-white British over the next few decades, and this does suggest a substantial demographic change. But in reality, it's not that substantial because it doesn't actually mean that much. For one thing, this classification of white British completely ignores the existence of people of mixed racial backgrounds, and somebody who's 3/4 white British might not noticeably be non-white at all, but they wouldn't be classified as 100% white British based on the way we currently classify things. Also, a lot of the people driving down the white British proportion of the UK population are still white. This includes, by the way, the barely not British Irish, who are considered their own country by themselves, even though I think most of the world doesn't really care about it and pretty much categorizes Irish people as basically British, but because of their foot stomping around this whole independence thing, they are, strictly speaking, not British yet. And the mixed parentage thing applies here too. If somebody has 3/4 completely British ancestry, but they have one Irish or one European grandparent, then they would not be 100% white British. They would probably go down as mixed European ancestry, as it's usually categorized as, even though if you met them on the street, you would have no way of knowing that they aren't British. As far as you're concerned, like, you do not know the ancestry of all of my grandparents. I could have an Irish grandparent or a European grandparent, and you wouldn't know anything about that. If you meet an average stranger on the street, you will not know whether they are white British, which sort of takes the sting out of the idea that the UK is going to become majority not white British anymore. Like, oh no, loads of people are no longer going to be what you wouldn't even know they were anyway. Terrifying. Well, racists do want you to be terrified, so they do equivocation. What they'll do is they'll have these videos showing places where the UK is becoming noticeably non-white, and then they will throw up these statistics about how the UK is going to become majority non-white British in just a few decades, and that will have you thinking that we're only a few decades away from the majority of the UK looking like central Birmingham or London or Manchester, when that's simply not accurate. Does it even matter that Britain is British, ethnically speaking? Well, I think it does. The entire idea of a country implies some sort of shared ethnic heritage. Even countries that like to pretend that they don't have a shared ethnic heritage are, well, how can I put this? Lying. For example, America, there's a reason why America is not Mexico. There's a reason why Trump wanted to put a wall on the southern border. Because it's a different country, and part of its identity is defined by those early Anglo-Saxon colonizers who first manifested America centuries ago in those original 13 colonies. So even if countries that pretend not to be defined by a shared ethnic heritage in fact quite clearly are, then certainly a more honest country like Britain must admit that we are in some way defined by ethnicity. I say this because whenever the Great Replacement is brought up, there's always some ambiguity about whether the argument is that it's not happening, or that even if it was happening, that wouldn't be bad. I've already made it pretty clear that I think it's not happening, and I will say that if it was happening in the extreme sense of the entire ethnic British population basically being replaced, yeah, I think that would be a bad thing. I mean, I like Britain, and I feel like if you took every single British person out of Britain and replaced them with a completely different group of people, you wouldn't really have Britain anymore. With this said, there are people who act as if any amount of immigration at all represents an existential threat to the UK, distinguished from the Great Replacement, if anything, only by degree, and I don't think that's true at all, and this is where I get to say the great progressive line that we love to say, this is a country of immigrants. There were people in the UK before the Celts, probably before that as well, but certainly Britain is defined as Britain by the successive waves of immigration from the Celts, the Romans, the Saxons, the Danes, the Normans. If you got rid of those waves of immigration, Britain wouldn't exist anymore. So yes, if you had 100% immigration and emigration, so the whole new population came in and everyone here right now left, you wouldn't have Britain anymore. That would destroy the country. But at the same time, also, if you had no immigration, that would also destroy the country, because the country is the result of immigration. Now, this doesn't write a ontological blank check for any amount of immigration. Obviously, the ship of Theseus doesn't mean you can swap anything for anything else and claim it's still the same. If you have 100% immigration and emigration, then you don't have the UK anymore. If you have 0% immigration and emigration, you don't have the UK anymore. It's about finding a balance. So if your main concern is just that Britain should continue to exist, then I can understand being mindful of ethnicity, but you can't argue that the UK should therefore be a monoracial society, because It never has been. Also, I'll say the obvious, Britain isn't completely defined by ethnicity. It's also defined by a shared history and common values. There is a transcendent idea of Britishness that goes way beyond ethnicity. Like, black British culture isn't just African culture, nor is it some kind of generic diasporic culture. There is something about it that's distinctly British, and sure, part of that is just maybe the accent, but I also think there's a general spirit of Britishness that you can see in the various racial subcultures of the UK. I firmly believe that a black or Asian person could play James Bond, because the main thing about James Bond, the essential thing that makes him James Bond, is that he's your typical charming British gentleman, and nothing about that demands that he be white. A lot of media is very globalized nowadays, and you can pretty much be guaranteed to see in entertainment people from all sorts of different backgrounds and countries. So with that said, it always feels a little bit significant when I see somebody who is British in a position that is of significance in the global media, regardless of race. I just can't imagine seeing a big blockbuster that's doing really well across the UK and all the characters are British, representing the British society, British culture, and just thinking, well, that doesn't count because they're not white. I can't understand how somebody could claim to love the UK while being racist, because I am unequivocally patriotic. I love the UK. I think the UK is easily the best country in the world, and it kind of annoys me that we're generally quite fatalistic and miserable in a way that I think really holds this country back. With this said though, I'd like to present my patriotic argument for a multicultural Britain. Firstly, obviously empire. The British Empire was the largest empire ever in history. It was one of the UK's greatest achievements. If any other country had any sort of achievement comparable to that, they would definitely celebrate it a lot. If you have something impressive that your country's done in your history, you're obviously going to want to celebrate that. Recently, unfortunately, a lot of the monuments to the UK's empire have been torn down due to some racial grievances that I think were very misguided. Suffice it to say, I would love to plaster the UK in all sorts of inanimate monuments to our imperial history. But what I also think would be impressive is a monument in the form of British society itself. Like, sure, having statues of times gone by is one thing, but what about having aspects of our society that just live and breathe that history? And for as long as the UK is a largely multicultural society, it has the semblance of being the imperial capital of an empire that spanned the entire world. If the British Empire was still around in our globalized society, I guarantee Britain would be an incredibly multicultural area that people from all over the world would flock to. So it's kind of nice that it still is that. If our greatest accomplishments were limited to our tiny island, I could understand people wanting to have an insular view of our identity where we say the main thing is just to protect ourselves from anyone else coming in. But considering it's the exact opposite, that Britain's greatest accomplishments have spanned the entire globe and impacted the entire globe, I just can't understand why somebody who has enthusiasm for Britain would say that we should completely cut ourselves off from that and, again, act as if the only thing that should be related to our identity should be limited to this tiny island. Next, religion. The UK is a Christian country. It has churches all over the place. It was one of the first countries in the world to become Christian and to have a majority Christian population. For a long time, it was one of the only places in Europe you could be a Christian without risking being tortured or killed. There are 2 entire continents that are mostly Christian, almost entirely as a result of the UK's influence. I don't think it's unreasonable to say if you want to be a British patriot, you have to celebrate Christianity. The 2 are intertwined. A complete racial analysis of Christianity would be complicated, but long story short, Christianity definitely celebrates multiculturalism. They were first called Christians in Antioch, where they began to preach in all sorts of different languages miraculously, so that they could communicate with all the people who'd come to Antioch from all sorts of different parts of the world, because it was a very multicultural city. Christianity was able to spread around the world because the Roman Empire had mostly got rid of borders. It's kind of weird that nowadays most British patriots would not be at all happy with some guy coming from from the Middle East to preach his new religion. So they call themselves patriots, and yet they are opposed to the conditions that allowed the UK's national religion to get here in the first place. Originally, obviously, God's people were just the Jews, but the whole point of Christianity is that God's people actually, in the grand scheme of things, was supposed to end up being everyone, and eventually everyone was going to be called into God's community. So it's explicitly a religion that starts with this very ethnic-centered view of things where it's just the Jews that are God's people, and then it directly rejects that and moves on to the idea that actually this is for everyone. It's about everyone coming together, and it's about a community of different races and different cultures and different languages and different social positions. That's the point of Christianity. And what is the closest thing England has to a national song? The New Jerusalem is supposed to be a shining beacon to the world that everybody wants to come to and that welcomes everyone. So you literally can't sing England's unofficial national anthem without saying that you will fight tooth and nail to make England a multicultural society. And by the way, when I found that song on YouTube so I could include it, I scrolled through the comments because I was like, I wonder if there'll be any racists completely misunderstanding the point of the song. And I'm glad to report, no, actually, most of the comments are from people outside of England saying how much they like the song and how much they like England, which is great because that's what the song is supposed to be about. So if you're patriotic, then you have to be at least a cultural Christian, even if you're not convinced by the theological claims, which means you really do have to be pro the UK becoming more diverse. And by the way, if these racists wanted to do their little videos where they walk around and show what a disaster it is that the UK is so multicultural now and filled with so many different groups from all sorts of areas, different races, if they wanted to make those fear-mongering videos, they don't need to go to London or Birmingham to the town centres. What they could do is just go to any church. Finally, the UK invented liberalism. Now, liberalism is kind of difficult to define, but I think however you define it, you would say that all of the early pioneers of liberalism were either British or early Americans who were obviously very heavily influenced by Britain. How you get from liberalism to pro-immigration isn't exactly uncomplicated. Initially, liberalism was about equal rights for all and representation for the common man in opposition to autocratic tyranny. You could say, well, equal rights doesn't mean a right to live wherever you like, and what could be more autocratic than the way the government has forced immigration upon us? I point out that a quite singular guiding principle of liberalism is a rejection of arbitrary rule. After all, what is a lack of equal rights but a arbitrary group being given more rights than the rest? What is tyranny if not the arbitrary whim of a ruler taking precedent over righteousness and reason in governance? If liberalism is therefore about rejecting arbitrariness, we'd have to recognise that we shouldn't put too much significance on something as arbitrary as where you happen to have been born. And if you're still not convinced, one of the biggest peak lib moments in British history was the Glorious Revolution, where the British people overthrew the tyrannical king James II, and with whom did they decide to replace him? William III from the Netherlands. If you're a British patriot who's nostalgic for the olden days, I agree. I want to go back to those days too, when being a British patriot meant choosing a foreign king who would rule righteously over a king who was born in the UK but was ruling as a tyrant. That seems like a good mentality for a country to have. If you're not from the UK, by the way, I recognise a lot of these arguments might not apply. If you're from Slovakia and you don't like the idea of a multicultural society, I don't know if I have any real arguments against that. Most countries did not have a globe-spanning empire. Most countries are not majority or historically Christian. Most countries were not early pioneers of liberalism. But if you're from the UK and you claim to be a patriot, then I don't think you can be against multiculturalism, because those three things I just mentioned, they're not small, insignificant parts of British culture, British identity, British heritage, British values. They're quite foundational pillars of what it means to be British, and all of them would suggest that we should recognize the values of and embrace multiculturalism. By the way, speaking of patriotism, I don't think it should go unmentioned that one reason we might want to be open to the idea of many different immigrants coming to the UK is that we should recognize that maybe a lot of people are going to like the UK. After all, you don't have to be British to think that Britain is the greatest country in the world. That's like saying you'd have to be British to think that the Earth is a globe or that 2 + 2 = 4. Seriously, I have an Indian grandmother, not by blood, she's my granddad's second wife, but she has a plate that was made in the UK and it has the Union Jack on the back of it, and she bought it in India. And one time she showed it to me and she was saying how she bought this in India because she dreamed about moving to the UK. She loved the idea of the UK. She loved Britain. She loved the idea of being British. And she had this thing that was made in Britain to centre that desire because she loved Britain so much. The British political establishment has done everything they can to tank this country and completely destroy it. But despite that, I guarantee there are still many, many people across the globe who were not born in Britain, but they've heard about Britain, and the things they've heard about Britain make them love this country. And I think that counts for something significant. If we're allowed to live here just because we were born here, surely people who weren't born in the UK, who chose actively to identify with the UK, despite not being from this country, surely they have almost even more right to live here. Like, fun fact, the reason why Hawaii has a Union Jack in their flag is not because they were part of the British Empire. They were never part of the British Empire. But their first king, King Kamehameha, was such a massive fan of the UK. He loved everything about the UK so much that he just wanted to have his country be identified with and associated with it. And that's kind of awesome. If you're a British patriot, surely you want the UK to become better, and that's only going to mean more people feeling this way about Britain, more people choosing to like Britain despite never having been here, and I would think surely that's something to celebrate rather than fear. Of course, there is one group that doesn't like Britain, and this is actually quite a dangerous group that presents a serious existential threat to the UK. I'm speaking, of course, of woke, middle-class, university-educated students who are mostly white. The thing is, if you have an enthusiasm for British history and a desire to celebrate that, then you need to recognise that there is no barrier to doing that falls along racial lines. Racists are proven wrong by objective reality on pretty much a daily basis, but one particularly salient example was the 2020 Black Lives Matter riots. A lot of people in the UK have kind of negative feelings about these riots, I think for mostly good reasons. One of the big moments that stands out was when Edward Colston's statue was torn down in Bristol. Edward Colston was a merchant who made a lot of money and gave a lot of that money back to his community, but because he was operating at a time when slavery was legal across the entire globe, obviously being a merchant, he was also a slave trader. So to me, this is pretty cut and dry. Britain has always been a naval and mercantile power. Bristol is one of Britain's key ports from which its naval and mercantile power has flowed. It makes sense that we would want to celebrate one of our greatest naval merchants from that city. It's part of our national heritage and it's part of the local history of that area. The fact he was a slave trader is barely worth a marginal passing acknowledgement. Every country at that time practiced slavery. It was just a result of the time he was born. More significantly though, we shouldn't have torn down his statue because to do so is insanely white supremacist. After all, African societies have practiced slavery for centuries. They were practicing slavery long before Europeans showed up, and they are continuing to practice slavery now, long after Europeans abolished the slave trade. Pretty much any great person from African history definitely owns slaves, and that's fine, it's part of their culture. Africans should be completely free to celebrate people like Mansa Musa, even though he owned literally thousands of slaves. In fact, we should all learn about Mansa Musa and many of the other other African kings, because that obviously helps to push back against some ahistorical narratives about African history that try to downplay the significance of these great empires and civilizations. We should acknowledge them and we should celebrate them. And certainly Africans definitely should celebrate these people. The issue is if you then say that Europeans can't celebrate certain European people because you think that they are morally culpable for arriving in Africa and accepting the slave trade. In other words, you're saying that Europeans should have known better. You're holding them to a higher standard than African people. Considering that Africans were far more entrenched enslavers, whereas Europeans have generally been more adverse to slavery, to look at European history and say, the problem is they weren't anti-slavery enough. They should have immediately showed up in Africa and guided by their perfect innate righteousness and indignation, they should have immediately refused to have anything to do with the slave trade. You are holding Europeans to an insanely high moral standard, and there's no explanation for why you do that other than that you think that Europeans are in some sense innately morally superior to black people, and that is white supremacist. So I'm not a white supremacist, obviously. I'm making a whole video debunking racism, and therefore I think that we should celebrate black people while acknowledging that maybe they were products of their time, and we should also celebrate white people while acknowledging they were maybe products of their time, and that shouldn't be an issue. The only exception where I say maybe we shouldn't celebrate it is if what somebody was famous for was directly related to certain racist or contemporarily problematic ideas. Like, I do kind of get the pushback against celebrating Confederate generals. You can't say that they were just products of their time because they were literally fighting against a whole load of abolitionist states, and the whole reason for the war was protecting the enslavement of black people. Even then though, I can understand somebody saying, well, okay, sure, they were fighting for a bad side, probably for bad reasons, but still, if they're a good general, shouldn't we still be able to celebrate them? If the most fantastic general in the world was serving under the most evil regime in the world, shouldn't we still celebrate the fact that they were a fantastic general? Isn't that something still worth acknowledging? Still, clearly in the case of people from British history who have been commemorated and celebrated with these statues, these are not examples of people who are being celebrated directly for their commitment to racism or entrenching and benefiting from racial injustice. But there clearly are some white supremacists in the UK who think that white people should be held to a uniquely high moral standard, and in the 18th century, they should have just known better than every other civilization because I guess white people are magically, innately more moral, and these white supremacists did tear down the statue of Edward Colston. But here's the thing though, these white supremacists, unsurprisingly, they mostly weren't black people, mostly they were white university students. Like I say, racists are proved wrong often, and in the racial strife of 2020, they were proved wrong again, because in reality, it didn't fall along racial lines. There were many black people and people from other non-white communities in the UK who had absolutely no interest in tearing down these statues of great British people from history. The real distinction was between the majority of people and a small minority of privileged, indoctrinated university students who held to radical beliefs completely at odds with the desires of most people in this country. This is why I wince in embarrassment when I hear people say we need to heal this country by getting rid of the ethnic minorities who hate us and want to destroy this country. And I'm thinking, okay, are white university students an ethnic minority now? Because they're the only people I'm seeing who really seem committed to hating and wanting to destroy this country. Are you saying we should deport them? There's this YouTuber who does travel vlogs, and he has a lot of racialistic analysis that I don't really agree with, but I still watch his stuff because I think his vlogs are kind of entertaining. Recently, he went to South Africa and he did an interview with someone who said that in a multicultural society, elections are nothing more than collecting census data for the various ethnic groups. And there were unironically people in the comments section saying that this was prescient to the future of Britain. I was like, no, it's not. There just isn't that big of a political divide along racial lines in the UK. I mean, if you look at recent data, Indians are kind of split down the middle between Conservatives and Labour. Black people are much more overwhelmingly Labour, but that can be better explained by them being more likely to be urban, more likely to be lower income earners, and also more likely to have more children, meaning they'd have a younger population, and young people tend to vote Labour. There's no reason to think it's entirely or even mostly about racial divisions and priorities. The idea that we should have this big existential crisis over the racial divisions in our politics while completely ignoring the much more significant regional and age-based divisions just seems stupid. I'm not going to pretend integration has been handled perfectly. There are racial divisions in this country. There is racial strife in this country. I don't want to completely ignore that, but it's hard to ignore the fact that there's lots of problems in our society right now generally, and I can't help but think if we solved those problems and focused on those issues, then we'd actually find that the racial strife would pretty much completely go away. This leads to the other nonsense argument, which is that we need a monoracial society in order to be high trust. The basic argument goes that human beings love to form in-groups and out-groups. Therefore, if we have a multiracial society, people are just going to want to keep to themselves and they're not going to trust as many other people in society, and we're going to have all sorts of problems. These people have actually already managed to debunk themselves on this point though, because pretty much the go-to argument now used is that there have been some studies that show that children very readily form tribalistic in-groups and out-groups, and the example is that they were given some arbitrary thing to basically split them into groups. So it could be given like a button. It's like, if you've got the button, you're a button haver. If you don't have the button, you're a button not haver, or whatever. And what these studies consistently find is that children then, having been defined and distinguished this way, will tend to prefer to hang out with people in the same group as them, with fellow button havers, and they'll start to have more negative feelings towards the not button havers or the button not havers. It should be obvious how this completely disproves their point though, because if you can create this in-group, out-group tribalistic mentality around something completely manufactured and arbitrary effortlessly, then it's hard to see why we should think that that same mentality around race is some natural, deeply ingrained thing. What we might expect is that a lot of people would form this in-group, out-group mentality around lots of other things other than race, and indeed we see that all the time. For example, sex. When I was growing up as a male, I had lots of male friends of all sorts of different races, whereas with females, there was a little bit more of a division there, a little bit more of a sense of unease, a sense of I didn't really know exactly what was going on there. It also applies to regions. I would feel much more comfortable hanging out with a black person from the southeast than I would with a white person from Yorkshire. The big distinction though that certainly in the UK is worth acknowledging is class, and I'm actually a very salient example here, because while being from the southeast I feel some sense of camaraderie to everyone from the southeast, there is a very significant exception that sometimes makes me feel like a foreigner. See, the southeast has a very marked distinction between the typical working class accent and the typical middle class accent and up. Definitely more of a stark distinction than anywhere else in the UK, probably anywhere else in the Anglosphere, possibly anywhere else in the world. See, the accent I have and am using right now is distinctly a southeastern accent. You might think of it as a generic British accent, but that's only really true because the majority of the UK's population and its cultural and financial capital comes out of the southeast. That's also where the capital is as well. There are a few indications that I'm from the southeast. The one thing that you can actually listen for is that I will occasionally not pronounce my THs and instead pronounce them as Fs. That's just a thing we do in the southeast. When I'm aware of it, I don't do it, so it's quite unlikely if you now immediately begin listening for it that you won't hear it, because I will probably be thinking about it. But for me, naturally, pronouncing my THs as Fs is a very normal thing to do, and sometimes if I'm really struggling to get through a script, I will consciously or intentionally decide not to say my THs because I find that makes it easier to read the script. So if I'm really struggling with the 40,000 feathers on a thrush, I will commit myself to saying 40,000 feathers on a thrush, and that feels much more easy to me. So that's one slight indication that I am specifically from the southeast as opposed to elsewhere. But that aside, you could call my accent received pronunciation or BBC English or posh, even though I think compared to actually posh people, my accent's quite different. But again, I guess comparison's the key thing here. See, the more popular accent of the southeast is something a bit more like Cockney. Technically, Cockney is reserved for London, but there's something quite similar to it that can be seen amongst a lot of people in the UK. It's the accent I would be likely to hear if I went to the mechanic, if I went to the town centre, if I went to the pub. It's the accent of my barber. It's the accent that you're likely to hear from the many people in the UK who are working class, and also a lot of the middle class people in the UK who are themselves quite directly descended from the aspirational working class, and obviously as a result still have that basic accent. So there's this man with a van who sells meat outside of a rugby club near me. He seems to be able to sell it at quite a discounted rate because he doesn't have to pay a lot of the costs associated with running a full-on shop. For all I know, it's not entirely legitimate, but won't hear me complaining. Anyway, so my dad found out about this through word of mouth, and he often goes there to pick up some meat from the meat man. But one day he had an injury and he wasn't able to cycle out to go see the meat man. So I was like, it's okay. I can go and pick up the meat from the meat man in his meat van. And in the queue, people were talking to each other. And I realized how out of place I was, because every single person was talking with this Cockney adjacent Southeast English accent that is readily distinguishable from my accent. If I were to say a single word, it would have been immediately obvious to everyone there that I was out of place, that I was different. And in that moment, I was overcome with a sensation of being a minority in my own country, a foreigner in my own land. And since then, I've been aware of it when I've gone to the town centre or the pub, just realizing that most people there do not sound like me. Now, I don't want to overstate this case. Obviously, there are plenty of working class people around. I have working class members of my family. I have working class friends when I went to school. So clearly, I am familiar with it, and it's not something that's constantly playing on my mind. But I did just realize how weird it is that I am speaking an accent that is completely native to where I come from. This is a southeastern accent, definitely, and yet it is decidedly the minority accent in this area. And the big point in all of this is that race has absolutely nothing to do with it. I think the UK should be pretty impervious to racial division. I mean, it's clearly not, but it should be, because we are a society that is very much divided by class. And you do see in reality a lot of the time, especially amongst just normal people, that there will be multiracial groups of friends who are connected clearly more by class or vocation than ethnicity. Also, religion, that warrants a mention. The point is, there are so many ways that people can divide themselves. So this argument that while people will naturally divide off into groups and form, in-groups and out-groups, that clearly proves that multiculturalism will never work because people will inevitably choose to divide themselves by ethnicity and race. There's no argument that's been given to that, and I would say the people who are claiming that are, in fact, talking out of their arse. Just as an aside, I'd like to address the whole racial superiority thing. It's very stupid, honestly, because the entire race realist analysis amounts to nothing more than observing the current condition of various groups and being like, I think that's explained by race. The stupid thing about this, of course, being, well, isn't it interesting that this natural racial superiority just so happens to line up perfectly with pretty much what you'd expect if you were simply engaged in a cursory geographical materialist analysis? Obviously, such analysis can be simplistic. What happens to a civilization is more sophisticated than purely guns, germs, and steel. But I think an obvious thing to look at would be access to trade routes, because that's the way you interact with people, it's the way you gain access to resources, and it's the way you gain access to new ideas. So that's a key way that civilizations are going to develop. And insofar as development is a linear path, some of the last places in the world to develop were in southern Africa and the indigenous Australians. And they happen to just be in places that are very arid, so the population would be incredibly spread out and sparse, and there would not have been very many opportunities for trade routes with which they'd have interacted with other groups. What a shock! In order to prove race realism right, there'd have to be an example of a particular group that achieved tremendous success in direct contrast to what you'd expect, purely looking at the geographical material reality of their spawn point. And while there have been some anomalies where certain groups have done slightly better than you'd expect, there really hasn't been any clear standout examples of that, and certainly there haven't been any such examples of that where the group has been white. On the contrary, when white people have been on the outskirts of civilization, they've been viewed as barbarians. Don't forget that when Boudica first did her big rebellion against the Roman Empire, they massacred civilian populations. They tortured women and tore children out of their pregnant mothers' bellies. They did all sorts of horrible, savage stuff, and the Romans would have regarded them as savages. The Lord of the Rings is a fantasy. In reality, we did not have a primordial history of noble white people building legendary citadels, defending civilization against an evil horde of darkness. If The Lord of the Rings actually reflected our real history, it would have been much darker-skinned people defending civilization against a disorganized horde of Germanic brutes. With this said, I should mention the riots, which, like I say, are one of my main motivations for making this video now. I've always known that white supremacy is nonsense, but these riots in the UK recently have really just driven that point home. I got hungry, so I got some tea and biscuits. Give me a moment. For those who don't know, recently a group of overwhelmingly white people decided to start rioting in the UK, and they have been smashing down shops, burning down community centres, attacking random people on the street, fighting with the police. If you told some Romans in the 1st century that the British were part of this uniquely racially superior white civilization, they would laugh in your face. And if you showed them some of the footage of these riots, they'd say, yep, that's exactly what I was expecting. If you showed riots exactly like this, but the rioters were black people, you would have racists saying the most insane things ever. They'd be using words like barbarians and savages. They'd be saying these people were animals. Well, if that's how hard you would go against this kind of behavior if it was coming from a non-white person, then the fact that white people are doing it means we have to say that this idea of racial supremacy goes completely out the window. I saw this one video of a group of kids in Liverpool who just descended on a shop and started looting it. White supremacists love to claim that certain racial groups are animals who just act on based instincts and lack higher human cognitive function. If I was to start making extreme claims like that about any group, I definitely wouldn't be excluding white people. I recently saw a tweet, which I probably won't be able to find, but it was somebody who posted a telephone box, one of those red British telephone boxes, that had been converted into a take a book, leave a book style community library that anyone could just open up and have access to. It's quite a common thing, actually. There's one walking distance from me, right next to the nursery school I went to. And basically the tweet was just saying, well, isn't this a lovely, cute, quaint little thing? And in response to this, there was some racist saying, oh, but you don't want to know about what's necessary to have the type of society where this thing is possible. And it was very obvious through subtext that they were talking about the need to have a monoracial society. I think like their literally name was like White Purity Now or something like that. And that's just so stupid and hilarious to me because, like I say, there is one of those walking distance from where I live. Where I live, it's only 77% white. And that's not 77% white British. That's 77% white full stop, meaning the other 23% of people, I mean, the mixed race thing still applies, but it's black people, Asian people, mixed ethnicity people, only 77% white. So, and yet somehow we still manage to have this thing that this guy thinks is apparently impossible in a multiracial society, I guess. I've already pointed out the whole high trust society thing is stupid, but these riots make it even more obviously stupid. Because, you know what? The area I live, it's a pretty nice area, honestly. It's only 77% white, which I guess means it's impossible it could be a nice area according to some people. But what's great is we haven't had any of these riots. We haven't had any of these stupid white people running around smashing stuff. And let me tell you, if there's one group of people in the UK right now that I'm worried would actually present a threat to our lovely little free use, easy access, community telephone box library situation, it's not the 23% of non-white people in this community, it's the significant number of white people all over the UK right now who seem to be smashing up and destroying things for no reason. Overall, I just haven't seen any argument for the idea of innate genetic racial superiority that isn't better explained by socioeconomic factors or other material historical analysis, especially considering the fact that when you actually look at the reality of history, a lot of the time, white people have been the disruptive barbarians antagonizing civilization from the sidelines. And to look at a lot of what's going on in the UK right now, it seems like there are plenty of white people keen to keep up that historical tradition. Also, while I'm here, let me give some takes on immigration. Firstly, obviously, illegal immigration needs to stop because the gangs that do this illegal immigration stuff, they are literally, definitionally engaged in human trafficking, and their crimes don't stop there. They do torture people, they do extort people, they do sell people into slavery, often sex slavery. So by legitimizing illegal immigration, you are basically running an advertising campaign for gangs that do some of the most evil, wicked crimes imaginable. And if you say, well, sure, but once these people get here illegally, we can't kick them out, we can't deport them, that wouldn't be fair, then you are literally saying that not only should paying these gangs for their services be a viable strategy to get into the UK, but potentially it's the best strategy to get into the UK. To say nothing of the fact, by the way, that there's a reasonable chance that travelling with these violent gangs might not be the best vetting process to get the types of people we really want to be coming to this country here. I hate Keir Starmer, so it pains me to be running defence for him, but he was recently unfairly maligned. Somebody was asking him about illegal immigrants to the UK and how can we repatriate them when a lot of them tear up their documents when they get into the UK, so we don't know for certain where they came from. And Keir responded to this by saying, well, okay, sure, but there are some cases where we do know where they've come from. And he gave the specific example of saying, well, there's lots of people who are coming to the UK illegally from Bangladesh, so we could send them back because we know where they're coming from. And a load of people who I guess must be racist really got upset at Keir for saying this because they felt that he was saying that he hates Bangladeshi people and wants all Bangladeshi people to be kicked out of the UK. And I say these people are racist because you'd have to be pretty racist to conflate illegal immigrants from a particular country with everyone from that country. In general, the whole anti-illegal immigration is racist line is itself intensely racist because you are literally conflating every single ethnic minority in the UK with a criminal. Last I checked, all minorities are criminals is a pretty racist take to have. Now, with this said, I'm obviously not anti-immigration, so what we should have is a well-managed system of legal immigration. In this regard, unfortunately, politicians are going to be politicians, which is to say they're going to continue to be scummy, disingenuous liars who don't actually say anything they really believe in. See, recently there was an interview on the radio where a government official was being asked about immigration, and they said the obvious line that people should stay in their countries and go through the legal process of claiming asylum instead of coming here illegally. And this politician was undone by one simple question. Okay, so how does that work? What is the legal process? Let's say there's somebody from Senegal and they want to claim asylum in the UK. How would they do that? And this politician completely unspooled. They had no idea what to say. They had no concept of what the actual process should be, what it should look like, and it was incredibly embarrassing for them. This is the big problem with the immigration debate. So many people just say things without thinking it through. Even when the thing they're saying is actually quite agreeable and sensible, they still haven't thought it through because they haven't actually come up with any idea to action the things they're saying and the things they're suggesting. If I was in charge of immigration, here's what I'd do. I'd make it so that across the developing world, there were all sorts of places people could go to begin their legal claim to asylum to enter the UK. And I would make sure that the knowledge of where these places were and how they worked and the process was well known. Certainly known by every single politician who would be being interviewed about immigration. But second of all, and also importantly, well known by the people who actually live in these countries. And I would have a little bit of a grace period where some people who come here illegally, I would maybe say, okay, we'll still process their asylum applications because maybe they still thought this was the best way. But, the point would be to make it clear, no, this is no longer the right way to go through this process. We do have clear ways that you can go through this legally. And eventually, after a few years, phase it out to the point where if anybody comes here illegally, if anybody pays these human trafficking gangs to get here illegally, that would be an automatic no on their asylum claim. So yeah, illegal immigration is bad and we need to stop it, but the main way to do that is to make it more obvious to people how they actually go through the legal process to enter the country. However, there are some people on the progressive left who genuinely seem to believe that conceptually, illegal immigration shouldn't be a thing because all immigration, I guess, should be legal. Now, on this channel, we like to follow things through to their logical conclusions. Let's actually think about what these people are saying. If illegal immigration should never be a thing, it should never be illegal to go somewhere, that means you think we should have completely open borders, meaning as long as somebody can, I guess, afford the flight to come over here, they should be allowed to stay here and have a family here and live here and get a job here. No questions asked, no barriers whatsoever. I genuinely can't believe anyone thinks that, because that would destroy the UK. Obviously it would destroy the UK. We are a pretty small island. We're smaller than the US state of Michigan, and we are home to 67 million people. Also, we have a lot of little villages around, a lot of rolling fields and countryside and a Shire-esque landscape that's quite important to our national identity. So we couldn't just become a vast urban sprawl to accommodate infinite numbers of immigrants. In terms of how many people we could sustain, I'd say a realistic upper limit would be the same population density as Japan, and if we had that same population density, that would translate to 80 million people in the UK, which is 13 million more than we currently have. So that does give us some room to play around with. However, I guarantee that if we had completely open borders, we would have far more than 13 million people coming here to the 6th largest economy in the world, even if, I suspect, quite quickly after we announce entirely open borders, we would cease to be the 6th largest economy in the world because the society and the country would be completely destroyed. With this said, I don't think the people who claim that anyone who has any concerns about immigration must be racist are actually being sincere. I don't think they can seriously think this. Like, they have to recognize on some level that there is a legitimate concern to be had about immigration. So I think they're probably just saying stuff they don't really believe in order to score cheap political points by calling people racist for saying things that are in fact entirely reasonable. With this said, I do have some opinions about the nature of immigration. A lot of people treat immigration as if it's just like a yes or no thing, a more or less kind of situation, whereas I think what really matters is exactly who is being let into the country. For example, I'd say I'm generally opposed to the mass migration of skilled labourers to the UK, because the UK is a very rich country. We should be able to educate our own population enough that we would have an abundance of skilled labourers. Our net migration for skilled labourers should be fewer than zero. We should be exporting more skilled labourers than we're bringing in. And what we certainly shouldn't be doing is what we're doing now, which is compensating for our lack of skilled labourers by bringing in poaching skilled labourers from the developing world. Obviously, aside from it being incredibly bad optics that our native population is smashing up high streets while all of our doctors weren't even born here, it's also very bad for the countries from which these doctors came, because they thought they were training up doctors to treat them and take care of them and stop people dying and getting sick, and now they are going to die and they are going to get sick because we stole all of their damn doctors. This is significant because a lot of the talk around immigration now is focused on a points-based system where the whole goal is to bring in skilled labourers, and I absolutely disagree. I think the majority of our immigration should be unskilled labourers who maybe come from not so great backgrounds, but who actually like the UK, who actually have expressed some kind of compatibility with British society, because those people are likely to fit in better. They're also likely to appreciate being here a lot more because they come from worse backgrounds, and they're likely to be greater beneficiaries of living here. An example of the danger of going the wrong way on this would be Canada. A lot of Canadians seem to really dislike Indians, and from what I've seen, I don't completely blame them. It seems like a lot of Indians in Canada have an incredibly obnoxious, entitled attitude, and they absolutely refuse to integrate. And I believe this is 100% a result of Canadian immigration policy seeming to prioritize bringing in highly skilled labour instead of prioritizing shared socio-cultural values. What this seems to have resulted in is lots of Indians who were already very privileged in India, who come from a society that has very backwards views about social stratification, who now have every reason to believe that they've earned their right to live in Canada through their skills and their economic situation, then moving here, or moving to Canada rather, and there it's quite likely they're going to have a bit of an attitude that's going to rub a lot of Canadians the wrong way. By contrast, a lot of the UK's Indian immigrant population came here after World War II when the UK had a manpower shortage, and these were less skilled people who were brought in to fill that gap, and they were very appreciative of the opportunity to come here and very willing to integrate, and those people today are some of the nicest people you can meet and their descendants, and they've been a big positive to the community, and it seems to dramatically contrast with how things have played out in Canada. So you can see how the exact same racial group can be part of a society in a completely different way depending on the precise context of how they came to immigrate to that country in the first place. The UK was recently at risk of doing something like this ourselves. There was a plan recently to double the amount of money that somebody would have to be making in order to sponsor somebody to live in the UK on a spousal visa. Now, as it is right now, I was only just able to meet that. I'm not a very money motivated person. I don't really care about making huge amounts, and one of my big priorities is this YouTube channel, which again is not exactly monetizable. So with this said, under this new system, I would have had to be making £38,000 a year. That is a staggeringly high wage, and my wife therefore just would not have been able to live in the UK. You may notice, by the way, this would have been an example of an ostensibly conservative government introducing a policy that is incredibly anti-marriage and anti-family, because no young people would be able to make that kind of money, so they just wouldn't have been able to get married and live together. But imagine the implications of this policy if it had actually been pushed through. My wife is Anglo-Saxon. She comes from a Presbyterian family. She shares pretty much all the British values, and she knows a lot about the UK and is very enthusiastic about living here, and yet she wouldn't have been able to. But some rich Arab who's a hardcore radical Islamist who hates British values and doesn't have any enthusiasm for the UK except for as a place where a lot of money can be made in our corporatocracy, they would be able to sponsor somebody to migrate here. So with this said, I'd much rather talk about the real world implications of the immigration policies we're putting in, rather than simply making it a more or less dichotomy, especially considering a lot of the policies that are being introduced to limit the amount of immigration would mostly be negatively affecting the kind of people we probably want to be living here in terms of making the UK the best country it can be, while not affecting a lot of the people that I think the average person probably wouldn't want to be living here as much. Overall though, again, with all of this, this is about the policies and the kind of person in terms of individual attitudes rather than any sort of racial aspect. Also, one final thing is that a lot of people might know I've been critical of Islam before, and they might think, well, how does that factor into this? And the answer is, as far as race is concerned, it doesn't. Because if you want to push back against Islam, one of the greatest allies in that would be the many Arab Christians who are perhaps even ex-Muslim. So if you're thinking about this in racial terms, you'd have to say that somebody who hates Islam so much, they think there's so much wrong with Islam, that they convert to Christianity in a country where that might carry with it a death sentence, and then they apply for asylum in the UK, you're saying, if you're operating on a racial lens, you're saying they should not be allowed to come here. So as far as Islam and race is concerned, it's irrelevant. So, in case I haven't made it clear, racism is stupid, and that's why it doesn't really matter whether or not the ideas I've been responding to here strictly fall under a definition of racism, because I've not been criticizing these ideas because they're racist. I've been criticizing these ideas because they're stupid. Some people might say that I'm racist for some things I've said. I don't care, because if you're going to dispute me with logic, with facts, show why what I'm saying is wrong. Don't just tell me that I'm racist, because that's not an argument. After all, I'm clearly happy with being called a transphobe or a bigot. I don't care what somebody calls me, I care about what's right and wrong. So when I see people saying that their racist beliefs are valid, but the media is just lying and manipulating things, I'm not inclined to automatically dismiss that. Clearly, I'm happy to not be seen as a progressive. Clearly, I'm happy to be politically incorrect. Clearly, I'm happy to court controversy. If there were good arguments for being racist, I would happily make those arguments if I thought that's where the weight of the argument lay. But instead, anytime I apply arguments and logic and evidence to any of these debates around race, I keep coming away with the inescapable conclusion that racists are a bunch of idiots. Anyway, everyone, I hope you enjoyed. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, especially comment if you're just going to complain about the fact that I've used the word racist and accuse me of using the word racist as some kind of thought-terminating cliche and a way to just dismiss somebody without really thinking about it, because it's always nice to know that somebody's literally not engaged with anything I've said in the video at all. That's always very reassuring to see. If you really like this video and you'd like to see more videos like it, well, possibly tough because I don't really talk about the race issue very much, but if the specific aspect you liked was me applying logic and reason to a controversial topic, then the good news is I do that all the time on this channel, so I'm sure you would appreciate that. And if you'd like to see even more, then you can give on Patreon and you would get access to an extra clip each week of me, not a clip, sorry, I'm ahead of myself, a whole video each week of me doing a bonus live reaction, which my Patreons nominate and vote on, and then I record it, and they're all very well received, and they're very much worth, whatever money you give on Patreon. So please check that out, and I will show you a clip. That's why I misspoke earlier, because I was like, you get an extra clip, because I was already thinking ahead to the clip, but you get a full video. Here's a clip of the full video.
When we're talking about the history of a trans person, well, they have been violated by categories, the wrong ones, and they're trying to emerge from violation. So let's...
Again, how can you not apply this exact same argument and just say, well, like, if you're going to say that a biological male has been violated by the category of being considered a man, why can't you say a white person's been violated by the category of, the categorization of being considered a white person? Like, why can you not say the exact same thing? Anyway, if that looks interesting, then you know what to do, and I will see you all next Wednesday.